Subset Games are responsible for two of the most imaginative strategy games of recent memory, FTL and Into the Breach. The team, Justin and Matthew, have been working together for the best part of a decade, ever since meeting while working at 2K Games in Shanghai. Both games are expert spins on a pretty familiar genre, and each of them in their own unique way. So while the boys were in town for GDC, we stuck them in our hot seat and asked them about designing games around crew management and time-traveling chess.
My name is Justin Ma. I'm half of Subset Games.
And I'm Matthew Davis, the other half.
Yeah, we both ended up working in China, in part because it was easier to find jobs there than in the US. I probably couldn't have gotten in the games industry as easily as I did over there.
That was 100% what happened to me.
Yeah.
I went to GDC when I was finishing uni, and I went to the 2K booth and gave applications or resumes, which you're doing everywhere, and mostly they just take him like, yeah, sure. But 2K said, if you're willing to move to China, then you can have a job.
I just moved to China and then tried to look for a job there. So I sort of, it seemed hard, so I was like, I'm not even gonna try, let's just go to China.
But this was 10 years ago, so who knows how much worse or better it is now.
And yeah, we both were roughly done with our time in China, and so Matt wanted to see if we wanted to make a few prototypes together, so we sort of had some savings enough to work for a year on a couple prototypes, and the first thing we worked on became FTL.
We managed to find the core game in 6 months. Like, we'd submitted to IGF in China, which we were finalists at, in only just 6 months after starting it.
Yeah,
which in hindsight is shocking. At the time, I'm like, that's how we make games, I guess. This is about how this works. But in hindsight, it was, it's so fast. And then just a year after that, we were done. When we started, we didn't know what we were making, and there was a lot of discussion in terms of what type of game is this going to be. Like, we started with the crew management concept, but then we didn't really know from there what kind of game we built around that.
Yeah, is it just a survival, like you have morale and food and you're just trying to travel? Like, it could have been a number of different games. It ended up being combat focused.
Yeah, well, when we were playing with like crazy stuff like zooming out and having you fly the ship like a third person.
Yeah, like directional shields, you know, like. The big turning point was when you were inspired by Tetris or something, where you're just like, what if we just put two ships on the screen all the time? And then you're like, focus on the crew movement.
So how do you come to how does that decision happen? Because like you said, like you think about a space combat game, where the ships are in space is generally the sort of like the main focus.
Well, that's kind of how we approach a lot of things, is that's generally how it's done. So what if we didn't do that?
Right.
And the crew management isn't what most games focus on, so let's just cut all the stuff that wasn't that and see how we can make a game out of that.
And usually that puts you in this weird nebulous state of like, I know what it isn't, but I don't know what it is, and then so you just sort of follow from there what is interesting, and then hopefully you find something fun that you can focus on and then narrow it down. There are some big turning points, like pushing for that IGF China build. Like, we basically turned it into a game. We turned a weird blob into a game. It was a bad game, but it was the first time it actually felt like a video game, and that was a big turning point.
Was that because of the like time constraint of having to get it in?
Yeah,
exactly.
Versus compared to Into the Breach, which didn't feel like a game until like 2.5 years in. Right?
Yeah, maybe because we had no time constraints.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. We have strong opinions about what we like and don't like about tactics and strategy games, so that influences how we approach the game as a whole. In terms of the broad concept of defensive rather than offensive, that was there from the beginning. Matt's first concept that he wanted to explore was, what would it be like to feel like you're willing to put yourself in danger to protect the buildings?
We had that as that first concept for sure, that we wanted collateral damage, but we didn't really intend to build the game around it. That came later when we were experimenting more with telegraphed attacks, where you knew what the enemy could do, and it made more sense for the buildings that couldn't run away to be the primary target.
And I feel like that was the turning point with the combat, at least for me, because it's like a new constraint. You're basically saying, what if the entire game had this different system for threat? And what would that mean for the rest of design? And so you sort of follow that down to pushing and manipulating enemies is a core element. Like killing enemies isn't fun. You're just removing the interesting thing, which was the threat. So if you want to really make that an enjoyable experience, what does that mean? It changes the types of weapons you want to make. It changes the types of the way the layout works. And so that was a big constraint on the combat design that happened relatively early and definitely shifted.
And you can see how that also leads to defensive stuff, because if killing them isn't fun, then it's more fun to play in a more defensive manner.
And if you're doing that and you're being more defensive, you don't want the victory condition to be kill all the enemies, which eventually led us to having the short battles that end on a timer, because you want to feel successful when you just delay them. Like, we want to encourage that feeling of mitigation is just as good as killing them.
The combat probably didn't solidify for a good 2.5 years, into really where you play today.
Until we were like, at that point we were like, okay, shift to content and releasing a game.
Which still took another 1.5 on top of that.
What's the most enjoyable part? The first 2.5 or the latter 1.5?
The first half of the first half and the second half of the second half.
It's that big half in the middle.
Ooh, yeah, that one was painful.
Both FTL and Into the Breach revel in flipping conventional design on its head. The former is a space combat game where the danger is in the long journey, not in the immediate battle, and the latter, a tactics game about mitigating collateral damage rather than inflicting it. In that respect, both of these games were incredibly challenging to design, as before they can teach players how to play, they first have to help them unlearn strategies that, by design, no longer apply.
The big challenge for us in terms of seeing whether it's going to work out is whether or not we can get people to the point where we're at. Like, we know what we're doing right now is enjoyable, so most of the challenge with Into the Breach after the core game was decided was, how do we get people to that point? How do we get them to understand the systems? And so most of the challenge was like conveying information in an understandable way. To get people to start discovering how things actually work.
The Into the Breach was a constant usability teaching questions for years. Well, FTL, we didn't really.
People just got it, just because.
Well, people got it like instinctually what the game was. I'm a starship captain.
Thematically, done.
And,
like,
and that was
the engines are on fire. Send the people to fix it. Done. Like, you get it.
And then the complex mechanics from there, I think they're more. It was easier to get them interested and chase them down because they're so immediately hooked on the core concept. Well, Into the Breach is a little bit more abstract, and that core theme isn't quite as exciting. There's less of an immediate narrative for the player to hook onto. And so they weren't necessarily going to chase down the core mechanics quite as quickly. And so we needed to guide the player more carefully to make sure they saw that the game had interesting elements. It just wasn't going to grab you in the same speed that FTL was.
Every time that I discovered something new that was a good strategy, like the first time that you attack your own unit to push it a little bit further to be able to do something, like, that's an aha moment that I'm like, oh, this process is fun. This process of learning and discovering is fun. And normally with games that, like, if you design everything out and you know every mechanic perfectly and how they interact perfectly, that's not really possible as a developer to get the discovery. And so there's some things I can't get the discovery of, like with FTL. I do not know what it's like to get attached to your crew members. Like, that's impossible.
We've never understood it.
Or like with Into the Breach, just the first aha moment of pushing an enemy out of the way and they now are attacking an empty space. Like, that may be a breakthrough for people first approaching the game, and like, so that I can't experience. I just have to, extrapolate that the higher level aha moments are fun, therefore hopefully the earlier ones are fun.
And the higher level ones are the ones that are where a lot of the complexity comes from.
Yeah.
And a lot of that maintaining of how do you get that system in your head and pay attention to it comes from seeing and finding those fringes constantly.
Like, the whole point of the Smoke Squad is to basically make you perceive the concept of smoke differently. And so even if the number of mechanics and the way they interact are relatively limited, by constantly forcing you to reassess what things are used for, it kind of keeps players on the toes, and you see opportunities everywhere. You don't just get complacent about, like, this is what this does and that's it. And you just force them to think, oh, now your unit is actually useful for chaining lightning through you. You could trade your health for more damage. Like, just the more opportunities to surprise people in that way, it just makes games really fun.
And the mech squads work very much in the sense of they're tutorials. They're designed to be tutorials. They're designed to introduce the new mechanics, the smoke, the fire, in a way that forces the player to engage in that mechanic. Because it's quite easy for a player to play a game, get comfortable with a certain way of playing a game, and then kind of get stuck and always play it that way. Well, if you force them to use a squad that relies on a very different approach, then they could do a lot better job exploring all the different systems and kind of finding all the boundaries that we've been very carefully putting into the game and would much rather they engage with.
Yeah, one thing that is troubling to me as a player is when, like in Dark Souls or something, I spent a lot of time figuring out how to win with a sword and shield, and then I want to play in a different play style, but I feel almost disincentivized because like I already know how to do that, and then I just always revert back to my default. So I want to try and make situations where that's not an option, essentially. You don't have to feel guilty for wanting to learn a new mechanic.
Both FTL and Into the Breach do a good job of using clever touches to establish a fiction in the worlds they inhabit. For instance, the buildings in Into the Breach pop speech bubbles full of relief, fear and support as battles begin and end. Each run in FTL was given a unique flavour thanks to cleverly written narrative bookends penned by Tom Joubert. While for Into the Breach, the duo managed to get famed RPG writer Chris Avallone to help out, but they fully admit to not being the easiest designers to collaborate with.
We did end up using Chris Avallone for Into the Breach, partly because I grew up with Chris Avallone's games and it was so cool to work with Chris Avallone.
Yeah,
when the opportunity presented itself, it was something that we wouldn't want to pass up. But Tom Joubert did a brilliant job on FTL, and it wasn't any indictment of Tom's work that we wanted to work with Chris, it was just to shake things up a bit.
Sometimes I feel like we put our contractors in a not great position where we're saying, we want you to get emotionally invested enough to help us figure out what would be best for the game in the ways that you're more skilled than we are, at the same time that we're saying, this is our baby and we have executive control over everything. And it's been a learning process for us for how to collaborate in ways that are fulfilling for other people. The way that we work isn't really suited very well for having other people jump in, meaning like we scrapped the majority of the game multiple times. This is not a good way to have contractors be brought in midway through.
On a more micro level, like towards the end,
Scrapping
the pilot
features.
abilities,
yeah.
We were swapping them in and out because we weren't sure what pilot abilities for Into the Breach we wanted to balance against the game design. Meanwhile, Chris is creating these really complex backstories and explanations and personalities that are inspired by the pilot abilities. And then we say 2 weeks before launch, oh wait, Chris, I'm sorry, this character you built around this ability, he doesn't have that ability anymore, he has a completely different ability. And at the end of the day, all the contractor work, like all that stuff to us, the game design is always the pillar that everything else has to like be constrained by. And so we end up disappointing contractors if we have to make game design decisions that knock onto that. Yeah. The nice one that is music, because I don't have an opinion on music, or as strong an opinion on music. So I feel like I'm a lot more able to say, Ben, go make amazing stuff, and then I put it in the game and I don't have to worry about it quite as much. Versus like the writing or the sound effects, you might get a little bit more micromanaging.
It sounds like the two of you make games very much for like yourselves, like you're making games that you're entertained by. Are you surprised when, you know, because FTL, like, I remember the thing that stands out to me first is the Kickstarter. Like you asked for that much and you got that much. Like, are you surprised by just how popular both these games have been?
Yes.
Perpetually.
Yeah. Never stops being weird.
Especially, I think the biggest shock was FTL, because we thought we were making just something only we would like initially. And we're like, no way people would be masochistic enough to want to play this terrible, awful game about dying in space. And then when people just responded really strongly to it, we were kind of shocked.
I think Into the Breach, we thought people wouldn't like as much, mostly because it was an even weirder, smaller experience. And coming off of FTL, they might have had expectations that Into the Breach didn't really satisfy the exact same type of game.
It's also a tactics game, so those don't sell that well.
No. We didn't expect it to be very big, and we knew it would be smaller than FTL. It is smaller than FTL. Everything that we ever make will be smaller than FTL. But it still ended up finding an audience much larger than we expected. We didn't think it would be winning Best Design at the Game Dev Choice Awards and stuff like that. Like, it's still shocking.
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah.